Buongiorno a tutti e a tutti, sono Massimo Leone, direttore del Centro per gli Studi Religiosi della Fondazione Bruno Kessler. Oggi abbiamo un nuovo appuntamento del nostro seminario annuale dedicato a trasformazione e conservazione nella religione e nell'etica, un ambito molto vasto che esploriamo da diversi punti di vista. Oggi abbiamo il piacere e l'onore di accogliere un contributo della professoressa Silvia Caprioglio Panizza, che è Core Project Senior Researcher, che ringrazio molto per la sua partecipazione. La professoressa ha ricoperto diversi ruoli accademici, tra l'altro è onorario Senior Research Fellow a University College Dublin, ha lavorato a Norwich, a Cambridge, anche in Italia, a Roma, a Tübingen, quindi una traiettoria molto internazionale, e la conosciamo anche perché è autrice di The Ethics of Attention, Engaging the Real with Murdoch and Simone Weil, che è un volume pubblicato da Routledge. È anche stata co-curatrice del volume del Murdoch and Weil, sempre pubblicato da Routledge, e poi ha un ruolo di curatela e anche di co-traduzione di Simone Weil nelle edizioni di Bloomsbury. Si occupa di psicologia morale, in particolare di questioni relative all'attenzione, alla fiducia, alla modalità morale e poi alle ricadute in ambito etico di tutte queste linee di ricerca. Oggi ci presenta una conferenza intitolata Murdoch and Weil on What Separates Us from Reality, credo in inglese, se non vado errato, forse in italiano, non lo so. Comunque siamo perfettamente bilingue, quindi qualunque decisione sarà la benvenuta. E la ringrazio ancora una volta perché ci porta anche a riflettere su questi bastioni del pensiero morale contemporaneo che abbiamo spesso sfiorato, ma sui quali forse non ci siamo mai concentrati con la dovuta attenzione. A nostra volta, e le cedo subito la parola.
Grazie mille e grazie a Paolo per l'invito e a tutti voi per essere qui per discutere di questi argomenti insieme. Mi fa molto piacere di essere in questo contesto, secondo me particolarmente congeniale ai temi che voglio trattare, anche appunto per l'intersezione tra etica e religione, nonostante il discorso che voglio portare è principalmente in ambito etico. Ha delle ricadute di tipo sia esistenziale sia religioso, soprattutto per il pensiero di Simone Weil. Io non sono abituata a parlare di filosofia in italiano, per cui ho preparato una presentazione in inglese e da una parte mi dispiace perché chiaramente sembra che tutti parliamo italiano, comunque abbiamo origini italiane, dall'altra parte credo che ne guadagneremo forse in precisione e in chiarezza. Poi magari nella discussione possiamo provare a ritornare alla lingua madre.
Va benissimo, comunque noi registriamo, quindi avere una registrazione per un pubblico internazionale ci fa sicuramente comodo, quindi grazie.
D'accordo. Allora, cominciamo e purtroppo io non posso vedervi, quindi sarà una presentazione solipsistica che è l'opposto di quello che vorrei discutere, ma soltanto per i prossimi 45-50 minuti. Condivido lo schermo, fatemi sapere se si vede. Bene, ok. Si vedono le slide?
Sì, perfettamente.
Perfetto. Okay, so I've been working for quite a long time on Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil, specifically spurred by my interest in the idea of attention, which I had an intuition is something that has been for a long time overlooked in morality, but seems to lay the foundations for a lot of moral thinking, including deliberation and action. So attention has seemed to me to be what underlies how we then think about specific moral problems, how we construe them as moral problems, and then lead towards the intellectual and affective response to moral problems. So in a way, attention is taking a step back before we try to solve moral problems and thinking about how do we even construe the world with which we engage when we start thinking about ethics in a narrower sense. Murdoch and Weil both quite strikingly present a view of ethics which is rooted in attention, where attention is the first and foremost moral task. Now, of course, Weil operated earlier than Murdoch, so that Murdoch was able to help herself to Simone Weil's thought. And the idea today is to show how their concepts of attention and the ways in which they relate to a sense of self actually differ more than has been acknowledged in the Murdochian literature. And that this has consequences for how we think about attention, how we think about ourselves, and how we think about the moral task more generally. So Murdoch quite explicitly acknowledges the influence on Simone Weil on her, although she never systematically discusses exactly how she inherits Weil. So sometimes it seems more like an inspiration, even though she even borrows her vocabulary. In The Idea of Perfection, which is an earlier essay, Murdoch writes, "I have used the word attention, which I borrow from Simone Weil, to express the idea of a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. I believe this to be the characteristic and proper mark of the active moral agent." This is a very, very widely quoted sentence from Murdoch, and it contains one of the earlier and one of the few definitions of attention that she offers. And I think this is very important for us to understand Murdochian attention, but we also need to be aware that in the later work, Metaphysics as a Guide to Moral, most notably, Murdoch seems to draw a little bit closer to Weil. But initially, she still expresses the idea that I'm borrowing this concept from Weil, and I'm going to use it for my own philosophy to describe what the active moral agent is supposed to be like. Now, this has a Platonic inspiration for both. So both Murdoch and Weil take Eros to be the central animating force of this kind of attention, where Eros is nothing but the love of truth and good, which here coincide. And it explains what now we would call moral motivation, as to why we are animated by any desire to act or think or know at all. But then they both read Plato as a mystic, Simone Weil very explicitly so that the idea of joining reality and joining the good through attention is not just an ethical imperative, but it is also an ontological and a metaphysical one. Now, this idea is that, therefore, especially if we take the mystical perspective, morality is primarily about the inner life. Of course, actions matter, but they matter as something that is grounded upon the inner life. And Murdoch's famous example of M&D, when a mother-in-law tries to change her views about a daughter-in-law, is supposed to present the idea that something can change morally and that is significant without occasioning any kind of outwardly observable change, any kind of action. So whilst in the post-Kantian tradition especially, we're used to thinking about morality as primarily grounded upon the will, Murdoch and Weil suggest that attention allows us to think about the will in the context of something greater, which both is shaped by, but also shapes and determines the will. So the basic idea is that our moral character, our moral quality, shows in how we see the world. And this is where attention is fundamental. It's not just what we do, it's not even our intentions or the will that we have, but simply the manner in which we see the world, we see reality. And here, the metaphor of vision is both fundamental but also very difficult because it comes very naturally to us to think about things that way. And yet, when we try to spell it out, we run into problems of moral perception. Do we literally see the world differently when we attend? In a way, we do, even perceptually. But what, of course, is trying to be captured here is a greater sense of worldview, which again helps itself to the same metaphor. How we construe, conceptualize, and relate to the world. And this is something I'm not going to have time to go into, but I'll be very happy to discuss later because it's something that interests me more and more. If attention is successful, if this idea of joining reality through the practice of attention is successful, what will happen is not just that we will know what's right, but that we will have a sense of obedience to reality. In other words, the outcome of attention will be a perception of reality which is so clear and so strong, including its moral elements, that it will have an effect on us to move us to think and act in a certain way, which does not feel like and does not seem to be a choice, but rather a response. What we might now call practical necessity. So here is the question that I would like to address, or rather the questions. If we take Weil and Murdoch seriously and accept, or at least as a hypothesis, that the most important task for us is to join reality, which means both ethically and metaphysically. And the idea of joining reality can mean different things, of course. It's a very broad metaphor. But a very modest interpretation is to have a truthful perception and understanding of reality, to remove whatever gets in the way from us seeing things as they are. And as I've been saying, in order to do that, what we need is a via negativa, because there is no clear external standard that will tell us that we have got moral reality right, internal to attention. So what we need to do is to remove what stands between us and reality, what separates us. And for both Weil and Murdoch, what stands between us and reality is the self. The self is a source of illusion, so what makes us go astray when we try to perceive reality clearly. And what it removes the self is attention. So we ought to attend. But of course, there are very big questions here. What does it mean to attend in this context? What does it mean to remove the self? And relatedly, what kind of concept of the self emerges from the idea of attention? And finally, what follows ethically from this idea of unselfed attention? Does it lead to a more desirable way of thinking about morality and operating morally? So, of course, this question of attention and the self is what I'm going to focus on today. And this is still part of unfinished business for me, because whilst I used to think that there was a clearer, straightforward answer for Murdoch, it seems that now there are two models that have emerged. And one is the more, what I'm going to call the tame view, which is, I think, what Murdoch mostly holds, and then a more radical view, which is, I think, Weil's idea of attention. And I think more and more these two views coming apart and showing us two different and both in some ways unsatisfactory ways of thinking about self and attention. So in both cases, we need to do some work to make all of the pieces fit. But this is a part of what I want to discuss with you. And I hold that on all of these counts, Murdoch and Weil are not quite saying the same things. Okay, so just to flesh out a little bit more this idea that attention is valuable, I want to stress that Weil and Murdoch are doing something quite radical here, which separates itself from the entire, or almost the entirety of the tradition of the ethics of attention as it's understood in the contemporary discourse. Now, if you have noticed, there seems to be an explosion in interest in attention and morality. But it's mostly about how do we use attention better? How do we give attention to the right objects? Especially with the technologies that seem to direct our attention in certain ways. How do we reclaim our capacity for attention and so on? And these are all very important questions. But they take attention as a tool that we can use in a good or in a bad way. We can direct to better or worse objects. What Murdoch and Weil are saying here is that actually attention is not just important because of how we use it. It is important in itself. And this is clearly a much more controversial idea. So first of all, they take attention to be a direction of consciousness. It's a direction towards reality. So it's not a state, it's a direction. And it's always, by definition, directed towards reality. So to attend means to engage with what is real. And I think here we already have a sense of the inherent value of attention just by taking this kind of definition, which I would argue is actually compatible with most of the philosophy of mind theories of attention, who, however, don't draw these conclusions. What is real is, again, by definition, outside and independent of us. And this is not a question of whether we can have mind-independent access to reality. It's just that the idea that reality is something that is not me. When I engage with reality, I'm engaging in something that is outside. So to attend is implicitly to make the following ethical moves. To recognize that there is a reality other than me, that reality matters, otherwise we wouldn't attend to it. And that attention is therefore seeking something true. Attention is a reality detector, as Brian O'Shaughnessy put it. And something true that you do not yet know. Otherwise, again, you wouldn't attend to it. And this goes back to the Platonic idea of eros as something we don't yet have. So we're directing our consciousness towards reality in order to find out something that is true and that is animated by some kind of motivation or desire, which doesn't have to be cognitively complex, is simply something that is implicit in the very act of attention. And that's what makes attention inherently valuable. Of course, it can go wrong, it can have bad consequences, but as such, it's something that acknowledges the reality outside of the self. So then it comes as no surprise that for both Murdoch and Weil, attention comes with something that Murdoch calls unselfing, because of the tension towards reality that is as part of the etymology of attention and tender, which implies some kind of separation, however, in Murdoch. It's a separation, and Weil, that is epistemic. I am separate from the world. I don't know the entirety of the world. But it's also existential and ontological. There is a sense in which attention is a way to remedy a distance that is felt between me and reality. And then when I attend, I fill my consciousness with reality and therefore bridge that gap. So the idea is that the success of attention is an overcoming of the separation between the self and the real. And again, I'm repeating myself, but this is very important. What separates it seems to be the self. And so attention is not the outcome, but at the same time, as we attend, we are also operating this kind of unselfing, as Murdoch calls it, or decreation, as Weil calls it. And even though Murdoch seems to be translating decreation as unselfing, décréation, as Weil says it, into unselfing, clearly it's not a very direct translation. And this is already one clue as to the difference between them. Weil wants to remove creation. Murdoch just wants to remove the self, and maybe not even the entirety of the self. So Murdoch's idea is that the self is a problem because it produces fantasies, and fantasies is everything that distorts reality. So to attend means either to strive to remove fantasies or to remove the self. In other words, do we just need to remove the bad outcome of the activity of the self, or do we need to remove the self as such? And on a simpler interpretation, Murdoch only needs the first one. She only needs to say that in attention we need to remove fantasies for various reasons. First is that the self is not only a source of fantasy. Otherwise, self-improvement, which is a part of a lot of ethical demands, wouldn't even get off the ground. What would you be improving if you don't even have a self? So self has to be more than just a source of fantasy. Again, so in attention we can only target fantasy and not the whole self. Secondly, self is not the only source of fantasy, so there may be other influences, social and political, which we might actually need to look at, rather than focusing only on the self. And finally, that the self is morally useful. Because for Murdoch, the self is also the source of imagination, it brings past experience, good character traits, all things that help us see more clearly rather than less clearly. So it helps in the process of attention. So what we need is to remove what Murdoch calls the ego, not the self. Where ego is just a self-concerned part or tendency, depending on how you want to see the self, which takes the self as an object. I am prone to taking myself to be more important than I am, and this is what gets in the way of reality, but also the self as a subject insofar as it is the source of illusion. Whenever I am projecting my own fears, desires, habits, that's the part of the self that's creating the fantasy, the ego. So Murdoch here seems to be saying that moral change comes from attention to the world, whose natural result is a decrease in egoism through an increased sense of reality of primarily other people, but also other things. Okay, so reality is distorted by the ego. The ego produces fantasy, and the key fantasy is about our own centrality and importance and our capacity to act on the world. So there is also an important fantasy about ourselves, which takes ourselves to be central and important, and that naturally creates fantasy. So this is where Murdoch comes closer to suggesting, well, maybe it is really the self that is the problem, because it seems to be impossible to think of you as a self without thinking that you have some kind of centrality, some kind of importance. So we are deluded about that. And yet it's very hard to, if not impossible, to operate as a self without experiencing this kind of centrality. So there are illusions. They're about the real and they're about us. And on a less demanding reading, these illusions come from the tendency, which is natural and unavoidable, but not pervasive, towards reflexivity, towards self-concern. And I call this a tame view. Unselfing in attention only means that removing the ego's selfishness. Yes, we do have a natural tendency towards fantasy, which is repetitive and mechanical, but that's not all the self does. Self is other things, as we have seen, including, crucially, the imagination. And here Murdoch is telling us that the imagination is necessary. We use it not to escape the world, but to join it. She makes a distinction between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy is distorting, imagination is reality seeking. Both come from some part of the self, but they have very different. Both are creative in a way. They create something new, but one by latching onto reality and the other by distancing itself from reality. So this is an individual-based and pluralistic view, which says that there are many good ways to grasp reality according to who you are. There is no one truthful outcome of attention. There can be many, ideally as long as they're compatible, but this is disputed. And you can have a personal vision, which is also truthful. So, just out of interest, this view is supported by some contemporary philosophy of mind. The idea of cognitive penetration suggests that there is a contribution of the self to perception. So not just to understanding, but to perception. Character traits, inner states, knowledge, her history, and so on, especially in the work of Susanna Siegel, can be beneficial and even necessary to correct perception of reality in a rich, thick sense. So what we need is lack of self-concern. Maybe I'm putting in too much material, but if you're familiar with Murdoch, she thinks that we need to recover the idea of original sin. But the idea of original sin for her is nothing but this sense of separation from reality, which comes from self-reflexivity, if you like, or maybe the self. And that is something that we need to overcome. And yet it seems that this kind of original sin, even though it's natural, it's not something that condemns us. It's something that we're still able to improve ourselves. So it's a tendency and not a state. However, this way of thinking about attention and the self still maintains the separateness of the world. And it maintains it in very important ways. Unselfing reduces the distortion coming from the self onto the world. And the world is then respected by paying attention to it and viewed as independent of my desires. So if I'm withdrawing the bad, distorting part of the self, the ego, not projecting my fears and desires, then the world will emerge as maximally separate in an ethically desirable way, because it is then possible as an object of knowledge on the one hand and as an object of respect on the other. So here separation, but also kinship, but mainly separation, emerges as a key to the ethical. And here is Murdoch, who says the more the separateness and differences of others is realized, and the fact that others' needs are as demanding as our own, the harder it becomes to treat a person as a thing. So there's a Kantian streak coming in here, which we can look at later. But what is important here is that attention allows us to realize not so much unity, in fact, separateness. Importantly, this is a psychological, not an ontological move. And on this view of attention, we see the world, but we do not join it. So was Murdoch then mistaken when she initially suggested that the most important task is to join reality, and that that's what imagination does? We need to change the function of the self, but not dismantle the self. It still remains as a clear barrier between what is me and what is not me. Okay, here's a recap of the first part. For Murdoch, separation seems to be essential to ethics, because it means to acknowledge and respect the other. The self is also essential, both as an agent and a creative co-constructor of that reality. Attention only modifies the self by changing its primary object, in other words, removing the reflexivity that's inherent in the fantasy ego mechanism. So unselfing removes not the self, but a tendency of the self. Now, there are some reasons why I think we may be dissatisfied with this view. First is that it seemed like the idea of attention was meant to do something more than just remove a small tendency of the self towards self-concern and give us knowledge. Otherwise, we could just talk about gaining knowledge. It was supposed to satisfy an ethical existential demand of removing a sense of separation between self and reality that is not removed simply by acquiring truthful perspective or acquiring knowledge. The second question is, well, then does it mean that attention really does yield such self-other separateness? Is there another way of thinking about attention and what we need to overcome in order to have successful attention that doesn't yield this kind of separateness? And the third question that I'll touch upon briefly at the end is, do we need that separation for ethics? Does ethics require that I see others, the world, as separate from me, so that I can then act rightly? So there are some exegetical reasons for doubting that the previous picture is all that we need, and this might be less interesting unless you're much into Murdoch. One is the use of the word unselfing. Why do you talk about unselfing if you only need to remove self-concern? Then it's the Whalian origin of ascension of unselfing in the creation. And then there is the fact that Murdoch does sometimes talk about removing the self in various parts of her work. So she seems to waver between a thicker and a thinner conception of the self, or between even a sense of separation and a sense of connection with reality in attention. But there are philosophical reasons, which are the ones that I'm going to go into. The first one is, as I said, that joining reality doesn't seem to be only an epistemic move, but it seems to be an ethical, broadly, an ontological, even an existential one. And that explains why we're invoking attention rather than just knowledge. The second reason is that if we start from attention to explain some operations of consciousness, instead of starting from a sense of a concept of the self and then go into attention, which might get into a very different place. And this is the idea of attentionalism as presented by Jonardon Gannery, that I will mention later. Thirdly is an inquiry into the experience of attention, if you like, the phenomenology of attention, which again, I'm not going to have much time for, but there is an important question about what does the experience of full, intense attention, which in my view is just attention, but maybe prolonged or made salient, suggest about the question of separation and the self. And here Buddhism will come in handy, because it suggests precisely the observation of the experience, which is a different kind of argument. It's a different kind of starting point, but it's another way of thinking about how do we understand something which is so elusive as the self and as the question of reality and separation. And then again, there are the implications of duality versus non-duality for ethics, self and other, self and worlds, or experiencing attention as a proper joining where the self falls away. And what does that mean for ethical thinking? So let's move towards another idea of attention, another concept of attention, where the self plays a different role. And interestingly, it is Murdoch herself who presents this other way of thinking about it in the later work Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. Now, I don't want to suggest that metaphysics, or MGM, as Murdochians like to call it, is simply a change of mind on Murdoch's part. She still, by and large, holds on to a substantial historical idea of self, because it's very important for her overall project of recovering the inner life and recovering the individual as the locus of morality, primarily. So she doesn't give up on that. But she, in some instances, moves towards what seems like a more radical and almost a mystical conception of the self in attention. And this is, for example, in chapter 8, when she talks about pure consciousness and attention. So there's a discussion of phenomenology in Zen Buddhism through an example of art. And the artist as the symbol of the maximally attentive agent, although the word agent is controversial here, subject, as a maximally attentive person. And something is revealed if we look at how artists operate, which Murdoch takes should be thought of as a paradigm for moral consciousness in general. So without making a claim that all artists are good, but that they show something fundamental about how we ought to relate to the world. And in this context, she shows that consciousness seems to change when we're paying attention in this intense way. And it changes in such a way that it becomes purified. But what it seems to be purified of is any sense of the self. So Murdoch's example is Cézanne. And she brings a letter by Rilke when he talks about experiencing Cézanne's painting. And Rilke here imagines what it must have been like for Cézanne and what his own impression of Cézanne's paintings are like. How does this kind of attention that Cézanne, according to Rilke, was able to put into his work manifest? And this is what Rilke says, quoted by Murdoch. Cézanne paintings have a sort of animal attentiveness. Cézanne was watching his subject with the attention of a dog, with humble objectiveness and culminating in a form of art that is anonymous. His attention was so pure that his consciousness was filled entirely by the object, and his paintings, now we might disagree if we look at the paintings, his paintings were the representation of a consciousness that only put there what he saw and not his own self, nothing to do with his own desires, memories, fears, qualities, and so on. So this is a revealing quote. Rilke says, other painters painted, I love this. And if you see a painting that shows I love this, you see the personal quality of the painter in the object. Cézanne painted, here it is. So even love, which Murdoch earlier presents or elsewhere presents as being fundamental to the act of attention, even love is utterly consumed without residue in the act of making. So whilst love is necessary for the erotic drive towards reality, the outcome in the painting is that there is not even that left anymore. There is no trace of the subject. So much more radical view here of what might be going on, and of course much more mysterious view of what might be going on in this act of attention, where the attentive experience is, yes, it is creative. Of course, the painting wasn't there before, and it was a painting that no one had created before. Nobody had seen those mountains in the same way as Cézanne had, and yet it's impersonal. It doesn't bear the mark of the subject. And this, incidentally, is what Murdoch is suggesting defines great art as well. She talks about Shakespeare in a similar way. So here attention seems like it's not personal. It's not something that calls in the historical individual. It's not intellectual or conceptual, even though elsewhere Murdoch talks about moral differences as precisely conceptual differences. It's not imaginative in the sense that imagination is personal, and yet it's still creative, which seems like attention. And it comes with an experience of complete presence, which is not described, interestingly, by the one who's attending, but the one who is observing the outcome of attention and says, well, here there was no sense of me and the landscape, but just the landscape. So here is the second alternative that I presented earlier when I asked, well, so is attention just removing fantasies, or is it about removing the self as such? And I want to take a look at what this might mean, this much more difficult and mysterious idea, by looking at Simone Weil and Zen Buddhism. Not the same, I acknowledge, but both of them are invoked by Murdoch in that chapter of Metaphysics as presenting this extreme, as she puts it, idea of attention and self. So attention on this view is not an activity that bears the quality of the self, but one that opens the mind to reality, and almost passively. So earlier we had a more active sense of attention. Here there is a more passive idea of attention, allows reality to make an impression on us. Now, clearly it's an activity as well, partly because in order to allow something to make an impression of us, we need to do something. It's not natural, as Murdoch reminds us, for us to do so. So there is an activity in allowing, but it's simply an allowing as a way of letting something in rather than projecting. And this activity, according to both Weilian and Zen views, is one that disrupts our idea of the self. Because in this activity, we have no sense of ourselves. And if we take this activity seriously, which we might not want to do, but if we do, we come to see the illusory nature of that which seemed to be so substantial just a second ago. When I was brooding, worrying, writing, talking, I had a sense of myself as a continuous historical being doing these things and seeing reality according to who I am. Now all of that seems to have fallen away. Does that mean that I was operating under some illusion created by reflexivity earlier? And Weil thinks that it is. So Weil thinks that, of course, we are central to ourselves because of the body, because of the fact that we are at the center of space and time for us. But that means that there is neither a metaphysical substance there, nor that we actually have this kind of centrality that we experience ourselves to have all the time. So that's an illusion. It's an illusion that we can't ever fully get rid of, but it is one. And that maybe in full attention, we come as close as possible to removing that. So for Weil, unlike Murdoch, it is the personal that's an interference between us and reality. And attention enables truth to become manifest from the outside, despite ourselves and even despite our efforts. So here is Weil in Gravity and Grace, which is just a collection of some of her writings and notebooks. But is what she says. With all things, it's always that what comes from outside, freely and as a surprise, as if a gift from heaven, that brings us pure joy. In the same way, real good can only come from outside ourselves, never from our own effort. So whatever contribution comes from even our own agency is not something that can be purely good, because what is purely good is only that which is real. And real means not something we've created here. So she has this idea of grace, which is, in a way, saying what she says in this quote. Grace is something that falls upon you, sometimes even despite yourself. And yet when you receive it, you recognize it. So this is what I've been calling the radical view. The metaphysical rejection, not of fantasy, but of the self, where there is no self and therefore there is no separation from reality, and attention takes us there. Now, there's a long story to be told about why Weil holds this view, and it has a dual part. There is a religious metaphysics, and then there is a philosophical reason. And I'm just going to very briefly summarize. The religious view comes from her cosmology, from the idea that, according to her, and this is a view that comes from the Kabbalah, God renounced himself to allow something other than himself exist, because God was fullness of being. So whenever something exists, it exists as a disruption, as a rupture in God's fullness of being. But of course, God is the good at the same time. So in order to restore the good, we have to make ourselves nothing. And we cannot, and well, we should not remove ourselves physically from this world. In fact, Weil is very clearly against suicide, so let's not interpret it that way. What disrupts this fullness is the metaphysical sense of the self. In other words, the exercise of our will as operating upon reality, or rather the illusion that we can operate upon reality. We can exercise our will, it's not going to have an effect. This is Weil's view. But the very exercise of the will is an acceptance of the created nature of who we are, and implicitly, therefore, an acceptance of God's withdrawal, and that is evil, according to Weil. So renouncing ourselves means allowing goodness to flood back in, if you like. And philosophically, well, there's a simpler way of thinking about this, but also very different, which is that anything personal interferes with the full manifestation of reality. The self is inimical to truth because the self as such is a distorted filter, even if it may seem inescapable. And the idea that for Weil is that when we attend, we can experience this. So it's something that can have a philosophical reasoning behind it, but in attention, we experience a different configuration of the self that we don't experience in any other context. Now, Murdoch juxtaposes Weil and Zen here, because in both there is a description of attention, Zen as presented by Katsuki Sekida in Zen Training, which is the book that Murdoch read. I don't know if she read any, but this is the one that she draws upon. So Zen is here presented as an experience-based philosophy, not a non-intellectual tradition, that asks you to look at what happens when you are present, when you touch an object, when you meditate, when you just pay attention to something. And Zen operates again also in a negative way by asking, why do we have this sense of the self? Do we need it? What does it really latch onto? And the idea that the starting point is precisely attention. So the very word has been traced back from Zen to Chan to the Sanskrit dhyana, which means meditation, which also means attending. And the practice of Zen for Sekida is nothing but meditative stillness, which aims at the pure consciousness that Murdoch is talking about. Not even enlightenment, which some Zen practitioners aim at, simply pure consciousness. So what attention is for Zen, quoted in Murdoch, is a discipline of meditation wherein the mind is alert but emptied of self, enabling pure awareness. And the disciplined practice of various skills may promote a similar unselfing or décréation, to use Simone Weil's vocabulary. Attend without thinking about. So the mind is alert but emptied of self, meaning we have no conception of ourselves while we meditate, while we attend. And this creates unselfing or decreation, which again is not the same thing, but she's talking about them as the same thing. So the idea of Zen pure consciousness is that we try to suspend every involvement of the personal ego. Now, let's not confuse this use of ego, however, with the use that Murdoch was making of it earlier. Here, ego is more synonymous with self. It doesn't mean just a movement of the self, like anything that is personal about me. But not by accidental insight, not by grace, but by discipline. So the root is different here. There is a discipline that allows us to perceive the self in a different way. And that's the discipline of attention. Excuse me. And what this discipline goes through is, first of all, rooting out habits, the habituated mode of consciousness. But this is not just a part of consciousness, because for Zen, every perception that we have comes from some kind of habit that we've developed. Even concepts that we use are, in a way, coming from habits that we've developed. So we need to strip of ourselves of everything that makes us who we are. And that's why an important concept in Zen is the beginner's mind, which is ready and empty. It has to be empty. So Murdoch is attracted to this, but she's also, I think, scared. There's also even an aesthetic reason here when she talks about the imageless austerity of Zen, which is supposed to represent the emptiness of the mind. And then she says, well, Weil felt a natural affinity with extremism, which she practiced in her own life. And then quotes a Japanese poem, "No self, no subject observes the serene waters of the lake." So this is meant to reflect the experience of somebody attending to the lake, where there is just the lake. And interestingly, and I put this here also for Paula's amusement, mountains are a metaphor that is used both by Weil and by Zen to talk about the experience of pure consciousness, where attention is devoid of self. In Zazen, sitting Zen, the activity of consciousness is stopped, and we cease to be aware of time, space, and causation. I'm not going to go that far, but what is important here is that at the extremity of having denied all and having nothing left to deny, we reach a state in which absolute silence and stillness reign. It's a condition of existence that recalls the impressive silence and stillness in the heart of the mountains. So all of the interference that comes from self is purified and still. And here is Weil describing attention. It's an activity of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. It means holding in our minds within reach of this thought, but on a lower level and not in contact with it, the diverse knowledge we've acquired. Our thought should be in relation to all particular and already formulated thoughts as a man on a mountain, who looks forwards but also sees below him forest and plain. Our thought should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that has to penetrate it. So here, there's actually not full emptiness, right? You can see that knowledge and experience and thoughts are not entirely gone, but they are somehow separate, detached. They're on a lower level. And what our thought does is go directly to the object in a way that is ready to receive it in its naked truth. And the naked truth means unimpeded by my contribution. So just to be clear, because this reading of Weil is disputed, the reading of Weil as a radical removal of the self is disputed. But what she's aiming at in attention is what you see at the bottom of this quote. I want to see a landscape as it is when I am not there. This is paradoxical because I have to be there to see the landscape. But what I'm aiming for in attention is this intense, detached, fully objective kind of perception. Now, it may be that is unachievable, but it still has to be something we're aiming for. And the support for this kind of view comes from the view called attentionalism, developed, as I mentioned earlier, by John Ardon Gannery, who proposes, by drawing both on contemporary Western philosophy of mind and classical and Buddhist traditions, that we look at the question of self starting from attention and not the other way around. In other words, he proposes attentionalism, holding that attention is the primary human mode of relating to the world. It's primary, it's fundamental. All the rest of our consciousness is built on that. But if you strip everything away, you're left with attention, and attention tells you something important about our consciousness. So attentionalism lends explanatory centrality to the mind. And this is distinct from representationalism, which takes the mind as representing the world. Attention is taken not to be representing the world, but to be a form of engagement, based upon which is so fundamental that that's what we need to explain everything else based upon. And on this view, the self that engages as attention is seen at best as a process, but not as a substance, because in every act of attention, there is a different modulation and a different mode of engagement. And this is where Murdoch methodologically differs, because she starts with a self. As I was saying, she has to, because her whole project is to recover a sense of the individual as important in morality. But what if we don't? What if we start from attention? So attentionalism is asking, what do we learn from attention? And considering intenseful attention, which, if you're interested in the philosophy of mind, technically would be called the sustained and non-divided attention. So the kind of attention that we think about when we're thinking about really, really attending, which doesn't mean that that's the only way in which we attend. And it's both focused and diffuse or open. So it can be either on a single object or simply open and letting whatever object wants to focus on its mind, whatever object is making an impression on us. And Gannery is also suggesting that when we attend, we don't see any self. When we attend in this way, which I will take as paradigmatic for attention as such, all you perceive is the object of your attention. And the question is, where is the self, but also where is the other? Because the object is not perceived as something else for me. Sorry. I'm speeding up because I know that I'm running out of time. I'm planning to finish by 12 so that we have time for discussion. Now, I just want to say that I'm not trying to suggest that Weil and Zen are presenting the same picture exactly. What they're doing is they're both moving towards a conception of attention where the self does not contribute but only interferes, and a conception of attention that is primary and central, so that starting from the experience of attention, we reach this sense of the self. But their metaphysics is different. First of all, Zen does not present a view of the self as something that we thought was there before and now there isn't one. Zen is rather, at least in the text that I've been looking at, agnostic about the existence of the self. And being agnostic means that we should not even raise this question, because when we are practicing, the question falls away. So it's not a denial. Agnosticism is probably the wrong way to describe it, but there is not a denial of the self. There is a falling away of the question, because there is no experience of the self in attention. And this is also why Zen presents this idea of the not one and not two. Self and world are not the same, but they're also not separate. We're denying both and affirming neither, and nothing else in its place. So Zen is trying to avoid metaphysical statements, but in denying both the separation and the unity of the self, it's also denying the distinction between self and other, and therefore reaching one sense of the unity that attention can bring about, which I suggested at the beginning. If in attention all I see is the other, I don't actually see an other, because all you have is the experience. As Sekida writes, the moment your hand touches the cup, there is only the touch. So there's no self or other. Wailean non-duality is different, because Weil does make a metaphysical statement about the negation of the self. Coming from the religious metaphysics, as we saw, and from the philosophical perspective, she says, I have to withdraw. And the only way I can withdraw is by refusing or not exercising my will. And this is how the world will manifest itself as it is. So it's a rich ontological unity. While Zen denied both one and two, both unity and separation, Weil promotes an ontological unity. But the experience seems to be the same, and the root is also the same, which is attention. Although Zen promotes the kind of discipline that Weil doesn't seem to need. So non-duality here is a union, or rather a realization that there was never a real separation in the first place. We only fell into the illusion of the separation by exercising our will and pretending to ourselves that we have a kind of agency and a kind of substance that we don't have. Okay, we have seen this. So unlike Zen, attention for Weil is joining in unity, where for Zen is joining into the removal of dichotomy. It's a small distinction, but it's a very important one, especially metaphysically. But for both of them, decreation is not destruction or limitation. It's simply the falling away of something that we thought was real. And this is different from Murdoch. So I think Zen helps because it brings to the fore the problematic nature of the assumption of the self-other duality, which is, for us, for most of us, a starting point. Why do you need to assume that? And it does so through attention, precisely, by showing up the no self or the self as some error illusion that comes from the very asking of a question that we needn't ask. And suggesting that in attention, the self, the question of a self doesn't even arise if you just look at what happens while you're attending. So there is a similarity here that brings in Cézanne, described by Murdoch and Simone Weil, and the creativity of Zen. It doesn't mean that we cannot create anything on the world, but what it means is that even what we create will be something that we do as a response to the reality that we see as flowing through us rather than from us. And this is, again, a difficult but a really interesting way of describing art that a lot of artists would use, painters but also poets, when they talk of themselves as being somehow possessed by the object. So, to conclude, there are differences between Murdoch and Weil on the role of the personal as opposed to the impersonal in ethics, on the role of imagination as opposed to pure consciousness that Weil is seeking, and, importantly, on the role of separation as opposed to existence. Murdoch stresses that ethics requires a sense of separation and difference. Weil stresses that what we really need to know is that the world outside of us exists. And by knowing that, it will no longer even be perceived as the world outside of us. It will simply be the world. And it's the very existence that having a strong sense of self denies. So we can be, and here I'm concluding, we're left with a question, well, but doesn't ethics need a sense of an other? In a way, traditionally, it seems that it does, because ethics is about negotiating between my interests and those of others, either by giving the others more weight or giving them equal weight. And Murdoch falls within this tradition, but with an important difference. She says, yes, of course, ethics needs another, but not in terms of competing interests, but primarily in terms of competing reality. If I fantasize, I will not acknowledge how real and separate the other is. So there is a clear importance of the other rooted in its epistemological status, even in the famous quote when she says, well, love is the realization that something other than you is real. However, there is a number of contradictions and tensions here that I've tried to bring out by looking at an alternative way. And one that comes from attention is that when the other is fully present in attention, the sense seems to be gone in experience. Second is that attention brings about self-improvement only insofar as self is renounced, as happens to the practice of attention. And if self-improvement is our goal, or a stated goal, then attention doesn't even get off the ground, because what we are trying to do is primarily reflexive, making ourselves better. So I'm going to skip this part, but Weil is presenting us with a completely different picture here, where what is personal and what is individual doesn't matter. What matters is the capacity to let something impersonal, universal, operate through us in the recognition of what is impersonal and universal in the world. In other words, attention is an ethical demand, but it's also existential and ontological. It is proposed by Weil and Murdoch alike as a response to a sense of solipsism, which is bad for us, but it's also bad for us, and this is where they focus, because it separates us from a reality that we need to move towards in order for any ethical project to even get off the ground. So attention has an instrumental function. I need to know the world in order to do the right things. But it has much more of a function than that. It is the function of realizing that most of the time my own mind interferes with reality. And that if I don't care about that, then I am missing the one fundamental ethical motivation, which is to see what is real, to join the real and not deny the world as it is. But if we practice attention, it seems that there is a possibility of denying the self and reaching a position of non-duality through the very concept of attention. Because, as we saw first, if you try to purify the self in attention, there will be a paradoxical self-regard. Secondly, that duality can create fellow feeling, protect interests, and do what's demanded of me, which is a standard view of morality. But finally, non-duality created by attention gives us something further, which is not a response to a demand of the world as separate from me to which I must rise, but a sense of obedience to the world, which is only possible if I no longer think of myself as separate, and if I no longer think of the world as standing there presenting a hypothetical requirement to which I can choose to respond or not to respond, but simply as presenting itself to me in a way that is already compulsively present to me. Because in the very act of attention, I am assenting to that reality. I am saying that I want the world to be as it is, and therefore the demands that it will impose through other people's needs or whatever it may be will be something that the very act of attention has already assented to. And so my response will be one of, as Weil and Murdoch put it, obedience or necessity, as opposed to doing the right thing. And this is a further consequence that I'm very happy to discuss. But I'm going to stop here, and thank you for your attention.